Hello and welcome to Castles and Legends. Today we have travelled to the far northeast of England in Northumberland for a weekend packed of wonderful historic sites. We're starting off with Warkworth Castle just behind me here. It may be ruinous, but it has a fascinating history to tell. Warkworth Castle is situated in a loop of the River Coquet in the village of Warkworth in Northumberland, England. It is widely believed that Prince Henry, son of the King of Scotland, David I, was responsible for establishing a Motte Bailey castle at the site in 1139. With that said, the actual first written mention of Warkworth Castle doesn't come until nearly 20 years later, in 1157, when it appears in a charter that loosely mentions that a castle and manor was granted to the prominent noble Roger Fitz-Eustace by King Henry II. What is more certain is that it was likely Roger's son, Robert Fitz-Roger, who was responsible for starting the castle that stands today, with his son John completing it. The construction ran from 1199 to 1214 and would have comprised the gatehouse, Carrickfergus Tower, the postern gate and the east curtain wall. In 1290, the very young Queen Margaret of Scotland died. With no direct successor, this created what is referred to as the succession crisis in Scotland, which resulted in 13 individuals rivalling for the throne. In an attempt to avoid plunging the country into civil war, King Edward I of England was asked to come north and arbitrate the proceedings. He did, but Edward went beyond just arbitrating, making a number of unpopular demands, backed up by troop movements to the border. This eventually led to the Anglo-Scottish Wars, or the First War of Independence, of 1296 to 1328, in which a later Robert Fitz-Roger and his son John de Clavering were involved in. Warkworth was besieged by the Scottish in 1327, but they failed to capture it. John de Clavering died in 1332, and even though he had previously arranged in 1311 that the king would inherit his property on his death, King Edward III had already granted the castle to Henry Percy, 2nd Baron Percy. The Percy family were establishing themselves as one of the most important and influential families in the north of England, and decided to make Warkworth the family's primary residence, which continued until the 17th century. Little changed at Warkworth until Henry, the 4th Baron Percy, became the first Earl of Northumberland in 1377. He began transforming the castle, with one great change being the construction of the Great Tower. Some years later, in 1399, King Richard II was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. This was primarily due to Richard's rule becoming erratic and ill-judged. Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland, was heavily involved in this deposition, which resulted in Henry taking the throne as King Henry IV. Henry's reign featured numerous rebellions, including one that was led by Henry Percy and his son Henry, famously known as Harry Hotspur. The Percy family had become more and more dissatisfied with the king, fueled by a number of grievances and disagreements, which included insufficiently being rewarded for the costs the family had provided for supporting the deposition, and lack of payments for the resources put into defending the English-Scottish border. It was in these border campaigns where Harry Hotspur earned his name, Hotspur, from the Scottish, a tribute to his effective commitment to the cause. In 1403, Hotspur was killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury, when leading his rebel army against the army of Henry IV. When Hotspur's father, the Earl, learnt of this, he fled, but he was eventually arrested with the announcement that his property would be seized by the king. However, this proved difficult, as when Henry's officers arrived at Warkworth, they were met by the Earl's 14-year-old son, who declared his loyalty to the king. He didn't have the authority to surrender the castle, so quite remarkably, it ended up remaining with the Percy family. Just a year later, in 1404, Henry Percy was pardoned, but the Earls soon continued to show his discontent with the king. In 1405, Percy joined an unsuccessful rebellion against the king, led by the Archbishop of York. Henry IV had had enough and sent his army north. As it approached, Percy fled across the border into Scotland. The captain of Warkworth Castle reportedly surrendered after the first few shots from the royal force's cannons. After Henry V came to the throne in 1413, a few years later in 1416, the Percy estates were once again restored to the family. The earldom was also restored, with Henry Percy, the son of Harry Hotspur, becoming the second Earl of Northumberland. During the War of the Roses, the Percy family supported the House of Lancaster and Henry VI. Henry, 2nd Earl of Northumberland, was killed during the start of the war at the Battle of St Albans in 1455. His son, who became the 3rd Earl, and was also called Henry, met the same fate, being killed at the Battle of Towton in 1461. Following these defeats, Henry VI was deposed, and Edward IV took the throne, becoming the first Yorkist king that same year. Warkworth Castle was taken away from the Percy family, and the Yorkists used it as their headquarters, with the Earl of Warwick overseeing operations as leader of the Yorkist forces. Edward IV gave the earldom to John Neville, Lord Montague, the brother of the Earl of Warwick. During his time as Earl, from 1464 to 69, he likely ordered the construction of the Montague Tower in the southeast corner of the Bailey. The tower was likely built as living space, accommodating more senior members of the household. In 1470 to 71, Edward IV restored the title and inheritance back to the Percy family and to the 3rd Earl's eldest son, Henry. This family really liked the name Henry. As the 4th Earl, he began remodelling the Bailey and decorated the Lion Tower with his heraldry. But in 1489, the Earl was murdered, possibly due to his previous decision to not commit his forces at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. This played a significant role in the defeat of Richard III and the subsequent ascension of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. The 6th Earl, another Henry, died in 1537 with no heirs, and once again the Percy estates went to the crown. Various royal officers appointed by the crown used Warkworth Castle while overseeing the regions of the Anglo-Scottish border. However, the majority of them were not prepared to pick up the bill for repairs, and by 1550 the castle was described as being in a state of disrepair. Eventually, the 6th Earl's nephew, Thomas Percy, was granted the family estates and earldom. Initially, he carried out a number of repairs to the castle, but Thomas had bigger plans to reorder the castle. But progress soon halted, as Thomas was involved in the unsuccessful Rising of the North, a revolt of the Catholic Northern Earls in which they tried to depose Queen Elizabeth I and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. In 1585, the castle passed to Henry Percy, the 9th Earl. Henry was later imprisoned due to his connections with Thomas Percy, one of the schemers of the infamous failed gunpowder plot of 1605, the attempt to blow up the House of Lords. As a result, Warkworth Castle was leased to Sir Ralph Grey, who had no interest in looking after it, so the castle was left to decay further. At the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642, King Charles I's forces held Warkworth Castle. Due to the long-running war between England and Scotland, the Scottish were able to capture the castle in 1644 after forcing the royalist garrison to surrender. Being sympathetic to the parliamentarians, the Scottish left the castle to Parliament, who installed a garrison of their own in 1648. During this time, the castle would have sustained further damage due to the ongoing fighting, and when the parliamentarian forces eventually pulled out, they removed the castle's doors and iron so that the castle could no longer be used for military purposes. This process, known as slighting, happened to a great number of castles after the Civil War. The 10th Earl, Algernon Percy, tried to get compensation for the damage, but was unsuccessful. The castle continued to be neglected through the next century. Despite the dilapidated state, by the end of the 18th century, Warkworth Castle started to attract tourists. Today, English Heritage manages the site, now classified as a Grade 1 listed building and a scheduled ancient monument, and it's open to the public to visit for a fee. What a maze the Great Tower was. All those rooms, passages, and I think there was 3 different stairwells. It must have looked so magnificent in its heyday. I hope you've enjoyed exploring with us and hearing about the history. Please do give us a like if you have, and subscribe if you haven't already. Tomorrow we're off to another historical site off in Northumberland. Had a bit of a cold northerly wind today. It's been a bit of a cold one, but it should clear up. So I hope to see you there. And that's about it. Bye for now.